Great. Welcome to the CEO panel. This is our annual event where we tap into some of the leading minds and leaders of the industry. And I'm Mike Rosenblatt, and I'm really pleased to co-chair this with Petra JANTZER. And we will be moderating in an alternate sort of way the panel. Our three panelists are John CROWLEY, and he's the president and CEO of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, probably known to most of you as Bio. We have Noubar, the founder and CEO of Flagship Pioneering, and co-founder and chairman of the board of Moderna. And hopefully some of you were here earlier in the day when Noubar was interviewed and gave a very stimulating fireside chat. And Chris VIEHBACHER, who's the president and the CEO of Biogen. We're going to get some food for thought about what's going on in our sector. And I'm just reminding people that tonight we'll get actual food and awards, including the Roy Vagelos Pro Bono Humanum Award, which will be presented this evening, and I hope that as many of you as possible will be there. Let me say a word about my co-chair, Petra. She is the Senior Managing Director, Global Life Sciences Lead for Accenture, which is the world's largest independent technology consulting and business services provider. It has more than 740,000 colleagues and annual revenues of $65 billion. It operates across more than 40 countries, and sectors, including health, biopharma, and medical technology. Her research and advisory expertise have helped many clients transform their sciences businesses. And Petra's also the co-founder of Advance Gender Equality in Business, and she's passionate about promoting gender equality globally. So let me turn over the beginning of our session to Petra, please.
Thank you very much. Mike, can you hear me? Because I had lost the mic for a second. Okay, very good. Sorry, everybody, you had to listen to that ad, but I think it's part of what we do. So very excited to be here. I feel very humbled and really excited to be able to co-moderate this panel for the fourth time in a year. And I look forward every year to hearing from our CEOs on stage about what is going on in our industry, and hear some reflections from these senior executives. This year, we want to talk a little bit about current challenges, but also opportunities of today's CEO, also reflecting on some big macro trends and macro events that are in place right now. So taking a big step back, you all know we have aging populations, we have healthcare budgets that are constrained at best. We have macroeconomic challenges that keep persisting across the world. And specifically for us in life sciences, we've seen more and more cost pressure and actually net price decrease, or pricing pressures and net price decrease for, I was in a panel earlier where, I don't know if George is still here, he said we should be the #1 industry with the highest returns on investment, actually given what we do, but yet we face these pricing pressures and net price decreases. On the other side, though, despite all of these challenges, we might argue, and that's going to be a topic of discussion today, that we are probably at an area of time where we might see a big shift in the industry. And while science, and again, I want to quote George here, science absolutely needs to remain in the center of what drives our industry. With the emergence of AI, generative AI, and these digital technologies, there is potentially an opportunity for our industry to become more efficient in drug discovery, to de-risk investments, and to personalize healthcare interactions for patients. And so Today, we want to reflect on these topics, and Mike and I have agreed or suggested to you a couple of topics to reflect on. So the first one is going to be the impact of the IRA on innovation. The second one's going to be the impact of these intelligent technologies and new tools that are available, what you see as CEOs in terms of impact. The third one is going to be on the many new modalities. That was also a discussion in the biotech panel earlier today. All of these fantastic things that are taking place, but what's the impact really of these, in particular if you look at manufacturing and commercialization of those? And then lastly, if we have time, what's interesting is also a shift in diversification of therapeutic areas. There's huge focus on oncology over many years. But if you look at pipeline and if you look at growth of reimbursed medications, we do see that, of course, metabolic disease is on the high rise, but also neurology is a very, very hot area if you look at predictions for the next decade, as well as if you look at the pipeline, and we have a few neurology experts here with us. So with that, Mike, why don't you get going?
Well, I'll start with the first topic, which is the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA. It was passed in 2022, and actually last year's CEO panel had a little discussion about it. You know, we know more about it now. Another year has passed. And so I'd like to look at the potential impact on R&D, how it may or may not be adjusting to what it sees down the line is the influence of the IRA. Chris, if you don't mind, I'll start with you to tell us maybe first specifically what the impact would be on your thinking as the CEO of Biogen, and then maybe any general thoughts about the IRA.
Thanks, Mike. I mean, the first thing is that on? Yeah. The first thing I'd say is, you know, we're just getting started with the IRA. It passed in 2022, but we've just seen the first cohort of companies go through the price negotiation back in September, and those have yet to actually be put in place. The next stage is you know, we're all going to pay a 20% tax on our Medicare sales. So that's starting for those of us who are looking at our annual operating plans for next year, that is coming into play. The first cohort of companies, though, you know, if you look at it, there were a lot of headline reductions from list price. But if you look at it on a net price, the actual average decrease was quote unquote only 10%. But I think we have to remember that the first cohort of products coming in had been on the market for quite a long time. And what most people don't know, there's actually a maximum price and a minimum price in the IRA. So the actual ability for CMS to negotiate was pretty limited. The next cohort is almost certainly going to have much bigger decreases. But all of that is really creating an awful lot of uncertainty. And, you know, it's not like we don't face uncertainty. We have uncertainty in abundance in what we do. And if you add now, well, what price am I going to get and for how long, that is certainly going to have some impact. Obviously, there's the big disconnect between small molecules and large molecules, and it's certainly causing a number of companies to think about, do I even bother with second and third indications? I think the oncology area will really particularly be affected. In rare diseases, we have an exemption from the IRA price negotiations. But if we were to add another indication, we would lose that. That will hopefully change. There is actually bipartisan legislation to try to change that. But it is having an impact on, you know, if you've taken quite a long time to develop that first indication, and you're a small molecule and you only have 9 years, you may find that you don't get that second indication approved until you've only got 3 or 4 years left in the market, and that's just not going to be enough to justify that decision. Now, I do think there are two implications for that, and one is the bar for innovation is only going to go up because you have to be able to justify much higher prices to be able to get a return on the huge amounts of money we invest. And the second thing is, to Petra's point, I do think we have to think about efficiency. We are going to have to be able to do R&D much cheaper. The biggest chunk of that is in development. And, we've been using tools like AI to actually try to accelerate recruitment of patients and do a better job of finding sites. And, I think some of those things can help, but the amount of money it takes to get a drug to market only goes up every year, but the total reward that we get over the years keeps shrinking. So we're gonna have to figure out how do we make ourselves a lot more efficient.
Noubar, your thoughts either, and we know Flagship Pioneering is mostly early stage, but not all of its comes. There are products in your group of companies, and the same question to you. Are there specifics that you adjust to based on this legislation, and your comments on the general impact?
So maybe I'll just add, because I think Chris gave a pretty comprehensive answer. I'd say three other minor additions that impact us. First of all, the chilling impact this has had on the investment community cannot be understated. As Chris said, we're in the uncertainty business, and they're in the risk business. And so the way they interpret uncertainty is just really, really high risk. And so this is a big task on that. It is increased cost of capital, undeniably. And the fact that you have to go all the way to the finish line not to know the size of the prize or that people can change it is definitely not conducive to big advances. Ironically, it actually might work for smallish advances, but if you're going to actually put billions of dollars into developing a whole new modality, you want a little bit more certainty that you can get paid for it. And this at least creates doubt. Doesn't mean you can't get paid for it, but just adds uncertainty. So that's one. Two, it has had I'd say, a complicating effect on pharma partners who are themselves reeling to try to figure out what to do with it in their R&D programs. And so therefore, if they knew what they wanted, it makes it easier for biotechs to fulfill it. If they don't know what their finance people are going to want them to work on, et cetera, that adds another degree of kind of a trickle-down uncertainty, if I can call it that. And we certainly feel that. And then finally, I'd say just on this multiple indication thing, one way to think about biotechnology or drug discovery is that you're essentially creating options, and any given indication it has correlated with it multiple other indications that create value pools. If what they have done, whether intentionally or not, is to essentially lower the value of the remaining option value of a first indication. So whereas in the past, you might have, as an innovator, figured out the lowest risk, shortest time, lowest cost path to proof of concept, only to then go after all the other indications, that is not a viable approach anymore. That fundamentally changes the option value for decision making, and I think that hasn't really become known to people very much, but it's definitely forcing people to work and pick their first indication differently. And that can't help either, given that if you're doing something for the first time, you don't have all perfect information. So I think that if it was intended to pave the way for more innovative drugs and maybe make it harder for less innovative drugs, it might be trying to do the latter, but it's also not doing the former. In other words, it's not paving the way for innovative drugs, in my view.
Terrific. John, do you agree with what Noubar and Chris have said, or what do you see from your broad view over the whole sector?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. I very much agree. And I think maybe it's important to start with some basic first principles of, what are we all trying to achieve? And of course, we want newer and better medicines. We want that to alleviate an enormous amount of human suffering, to extend, enhance life. I think we could reach agreement on that. We also need to make sure that we have access for everybody, that nobody ever goes a day without the medicines they need. To identify and break down barriers to access. The IRA, though, and Noubar hit on this absolutely, this crossed a divide. This brought us now into the point where there is no negotiation. This is the government, largely mandating prices for certain medicines, and Chris highlighted those dynamics incredibly well. What the IRA largely was an enormous transfer of capital from research and development in the biopharmaceutical industry to clean energy. There are a couple of mistakes that Chris highlighted that we're really focused on. We don't want to necessarily overturn the IRA. There are some good parts of the IRA in healthcare. the $2,000 out-of-pocket copay limits that are coming for seniors in the Medicare program. That's a good thing. And while we've all had to come together to find a way to pay for that, including the 20% tax on our industry that Chris talked about, that shouldn't be taken away from seniors as it begins to be implemented. So there are some good elements of it, but then there are some unintended consequences, and then there are some just pure mistakes. The politics of this being that, remember, originally this was going to be the Build Back America $5 trillion act, and then Joe Manchin in the White House said, well, okay, I can back something much smaller, and they kind of cut this deal without any hearings, without any discussion of the implications of a massive new piece of legislation and ultimately law. And so two things we're focused on, the 9 versus 13 that was touched on earlier, what that capital is rational. And when you start dividing not based on science, but forcing portfolios, investment decisions toward biologics away from small molecules, you're not following the science. We'll talk more about neuroscience and neurology. Many of the brain-based diseases, we need small molecules. I think there's a misperception that small molecules are pills and they're easy to make, and they're not. So many of them are among the most cutting edge of our science. So let's not force a discrimination, and we're starting to see a lot of that. Part of it is, though, difficult because it's hard to prove the negative of what otherwise could have been. But we've got some really good examples, and what we need to do now is to humanize it. And maybe toward the end we can talk a little bit about the implications of this past Tuesday. But here I think there is an opportunity. In prior Congress, the current Congress and administration has not been willing to look at improvements to the IRA, we'll call them. I think we will have that opportunity to selectively do that. I think we could do that with 9 versus 13. And we have a bipartisan piece of legislation called the EPIC Act introduced in the House and in the Senate that would address that and make it 13 versus 13. That would help enormously. The other is on the orphan piece. As Chris indicated, you develop a medicine for an orphan indication, you get exempted for the government pricing mechanisms down the road. So a great incentive for even more research into rare orphan diseases, which we need. The challenge is, though, if you have a platform technology, a medicine approved, and you want to apply that to another disease, you don't even need to get that approval to lose that exclusivity. Just getting the orphan designation, which could come in preclinical research. So that's had a very chilling effect in areas like rare muscle diseases, where there are platform technologies to strengthen muscle. Maybe a field like myostatin inhibitors that are being tested in spinal muscular atrophy and Duchenne. There are dozens and dozens of these rare diseases where that's a real impediment. There we get sympathy from leaders, lawmakers around that, and 9 versus 13 is a heavier lift, but I think there's an opportunity to fix those, which I think will help alleviate some of the worst parts of the IRA.
Maybe thank you for that, these reflections. I want to switch topics and get us talking about the intelligent technologies. Generative AI is in everybody's mind. I think I assume the majority of people here in the room are working with ChatGPT, Copilot, all of these things. And maybe I can just start with what Chris and Noubar, you just said. Chris, you mentioned the bar on science will only go up in order to sort of really get an economic return on the new drugs out there. And Noubar, you also just said one needs to be super smart about, what's the lead indication that you're going in, and actually how you also, I guess, prove in the right population what your asset can do. Can you, and maybe Noubar, I start with you. Maybe you want to reflect on what Gen AI or AI or intelligent technologies can do on the science side, but I'm certainly also interested in hearing your broader reflections on, will this truly make a difference for our industry?
So, again, I think it's a bit of definition in that generative kind of AI means kind of whatever people call it these days, and it seems like it came out of nowhere. The large language model version of this is the one that's impacting humanity immediately and imminently. So that's something that people are kind of confusing as all of generative AI. The reality is that in science, the notion of being able to use very large amounts of data to build unprecedented models that suggest either a level of, let's say, understanding of, or at least emulation of what's happening, that may not involve large language models, but nevertheless it comes from this field. That is a very big deal. In my view, that is a very, very big deal. So we, for example, had the opportunity 6 years ago almost, to launch into this space in the field of proteins. We created a company called Generate Biomedicines, which I believe today is in the far lead of applying computational design of antibodies and now other proteins against targets, arbitrary places on a target. And what we're finding is initially with transformer models, then with these diffusion models, now with adding the large language components, that we are in fact more and more able to kind of, let's say, with some level of predictability, generate proteins without having libraries of polyclonal antibodies to study, et cetera. So the thing is, everybody's always worried. There are a lot of purists. It turns out there are a lot of people who don't actually work in AI, who want it to work kind of de novo as purists. Look, the reality is that that's come a long, long way. And one of the interesting things that's ahead in proteins, and then if you look at every other molecule class, is what does that do to the underlying ability to do discovery? And what will that do to the ability to actually maximize the chance of getting quick proof of concept in human trials? And I think everywhere you look, the data is increasingly available, not to everybody, but you can get access. And we're finding it, at least our confidence level of doing the things it takes to be able to go from a totally unprecedented molecule to some level of biological proof of concept, that confidence is going up. So it's really popular to be optimistic about it, so now everybody wants to be pessimistic about it. So I go to every meeting and there's a session on whether AI is hype, and actually you're more popular if you call it hype. So since I don't care about popularity, I will say that we are in the extremely early stages, albeit way down a path, of being able to fundamentally transform the interaction between scientists and the complexity of nature. And let me just add one more thought to that. In biology, we're working largely on non-man-made systems. The regulator might be regulating man-made systems because there's humans that make drugs, etc. But when you're studying nature, there's a non-man-made version of this. Why does that matter? The level of complexity that we're dealing with, if in the 38 years I've been involved in applying technology to biology, what I've learned every step along the way is that we know less than we thought we knew. That curve has increased, has not decreased. So the more we find out, the more we realize how little we knew and how much hubris-filled our activity of doing science in this field really is, right? So why do I say all that? I think that the next wave of models, and even the current waves, are going to be able to begin to match the complexity that's inherent in biological systems. The problem is there's going to be humans in the middle trying to impose their will on the requirement for understanding. So it took many words to get. I should have had an LLM give me a shorter way of saying this. but let me tell you kind of what the bottom line is. As scientists, we require a level of understanding. That's the measure of merit. You can publish a paper if you can show some data and provide some explanation. But what if in the future explaining biological phenomena will not conform to human language, will not conform to the fact that our brains can't keep 7,500 interacting parts together straight? A paper is not the right. How are we going to what are we going to do? We're going to dumb down the ability to understand complex systems? Or are we going to start using these models to make decisions on complex systems that might come up with new disease treatments, but we don't know exactly how and why? So that's the field that we're entering. That's totally different than obviously ChatGPT, et cetera. But I think these tools are definitely tailor-made for the pursuit of science to create new products.
Thank you. And there are still purists out there. We heard it this morning. You said, to crack science, it takes persistence and genius. Chris, what's your view?
I think, first, I agree with everything that Noubar has said. I think this is going to be a tool to start. to give you two examples where we're using it, for instance, in small, you have a small molecule and you want to optimize that maybe for safety or maybe for efficacy. Well, we have a dry lab at Biogen, and you can generate 300,000 different, chemical structures. But what you want to do is say, well, which ones might be most interesting? And you can then look at disparate databases because you can say, all right, there's all kinds of information about different chemical scaffolds, but there's also a lot of papers have been written about these molecules. So what do you know about safety and efficacy related to various pieces of the scaffold? You put that together and you can get down to maybe 9 or 10 potential molecular structures that then a chemist will actually go and actually physically synthesize. In another case, the way we do clinical trials is really still pretty prehistoric, right? I mean, we've never really changed this in decades. We have the most cutting edge science and we have the least cutting edge technology to actually do a clinical trial, largely because obviously we know what an FDA requires, and the FDA hasn't always been willing to move very quickly. But you go around the world and you knock on doors of doctors and say, hey, I might be looking for this type of patient. You got any of those? Yeah, maybe I do. I'll call you once I find one. And as a result, most clinical trial sites generate maybe 1 or 2, and quite a significant percentage never actually generate a patient. Well, we had a major hospital say, we really like your drug. We think we found all the patients in our system. We worked with them using an AI tool and their medical records and some other databases, and we were able to create a virtual waiting room of about 50 patients for them. They, that data was available to them, not to us, but that suddenly got a whole new pool of patients. And, when you think about the need for efficiency, if you could actually recruit faster, find the physicians who have patients and help them to find patients, you could dramatically reduce the time. Every month we spend on a clinical trial is often eating into our patent time. So it could be pretty valuable if we can use that. But if you were in that previous panel, I don't think anybody really thinks that AI is going to suddenly invent a drug here. But it's certainly going to be able to use information in a much more efficient way.
John, you look like getting ready to say something.
You look like you're getting ready to ask something, so I figured I'd be prepared.
No, I mean, we hear a lot about R&D, impact in R&D on the science. Do you agree to that view? Do you see other areas?
It has gotten so costly, takes so much time, there's so much uncertainty in developing our medicines that it is leading to fewer and fewer medicines being developed. Again, the notion that the bar is so very high. I'll give you a very real world example. So for almost 19 years, I started and ran a company, Amicus Therapeutics. We made medicines in rare genetic diseases. We were honored here about 5 years ago, nominated for a Galien Prize for our first approved medicine, Galafold, for Fabry disease. That drug went into patients in 2005 when we started the company. Took 13 years to get that drug approved. And I'm not the public company CEO anymore, but I'll be mindful of all the rules and regs around that. But just to say that it's helped an enormous number of people around the world. When we had to do 3 years of dose ranging studies, very complex precision medicine with many mutations on the gene that could lead to the devastating symptoms for people living with Fabry disease. It was really hard pharmacology, dosing, science. If we had the tools, even the basic tools today of AI, that would have saved us, let's call it 1 out of our 3 years of dose ranging. That year is enormously valuable. And then when we went to our phase 3, and the FDA required a different study than the EMA, and we had to go head to head against an approved therapy in patients who had never taken a therapy, treatment naive, with certain mutations, willing to undergo multiple invasive kidney biopsies, willing to have a 50% chance of taking a placebo. So to Chris's point earlier, we had to open 67 clinical sites on 6 continents in 37 countries for a 60-patient study. It took us 2 years to enroll that study. We did the study, and we met the primary endpoint. We went to the FDA, and they said, due to an evolution in our thinking, we no longer believe that, I remember the words very well, an evolution in our thinking, we no longer believe that's an appropriate endpoint. Please go do another phase 3, looking at it was terrible. Europe was terrific. It took time and it was expensive, but we got there in Europe several years before the United States. So another opportunity here, imagine if we had AI to go through all of that data and to help us and to help regulators understand complex science and the challenges with regulators. There's so many advancements now, and we'll talk about them here. You'll honor people this evening for remarkable advancements in science and medicine. Regulatory science, by and large, has not kept pace. We need to elevate regulatory science, keeping the gold standard, safety and efficacy, but using all the tools available, and a tool like AI could be really important. How much time do we spend with reviewers going through farm tox data, preclinical packages, CMC data? I think that, and I've seen some wonderful demonstrations of tools in just the last few months. And one of the reasons I took this position 8 months ago at Bio is because I get formal quarterly meetings with FDA leadership, including the commissioner, but there's a strong informal dialogue. And I can also speak way more candidly than I ever could as a public company CEO about what works and what we need to do more of and what is not working. And so I'm actually very, very optimistic, and in particular, if we could take that into the clinical trial realm, all the AI technologies, and into the regulatory review cycles. And that's something I'm going to push for very, very hard. Because ultimately, very smart, sophisticated people at the FDA, they should be, their job is to make really difficult judgment calls based on risk-benefit assessments, looking at each disease and each molecule through that risk-benefit lens. Everything is risky that we do, but we have to assess it. That should be what they do. They exercise their medical scientific judgment. A lot of this other work, we can help them a great deal and help a lot of people. So that's where I'm excited about the technology.
So lots of excitement, and thank you also for helping hopefully to shape also the view of regulators, policymakers, decision makers.
And they've been excellent, I will say. Peter, Dr. Marks, Dr. Cavazzoni have been remarkable over the last period of time. So I'm very, very optimistic.
I do think beyond R&D there is value along the entire value chain. I really do think in the light of all these increasing modalities, amount of modalities and very different modalities, personally think there's big opportunity there as well. I'm handing over to you, Mike, to get us into the next topic.
Thanks, Petra. Well, AI until recently is something that was never on the planet before. We now have new therapeutic modalities, antibody drug conjugates, we have gene therapies, we have cell therapies, microbiome, radiopharmaceuticals, and there are estimates that the compounded annual growth rate for these now is over 30%, and will be that until at least 2030. So I wanted to kind of explore what it means to have a promising new modality. And Noubar, I'll start with you, since you have a assembly of companies that are expert in creating new platforms. So how do you decide, once you start to get some data, whether a platform is worth pursuing and where it can travel to in terms of what you talked about before, disease value, not necessarily dollar value?
Well, not easily and not well. So it is a very, very tricky thing, because if you, I can give you the example of mRNA, since we were involved in kind of the first voyage there. mRNA as a therapeutic had essentially been tried in decades before our entry into that space in 2010. And what people had concluded is that the innate immune response to unmodified or somewhat modified RNA was too strong to overcome. They had also concluded that the delivery techniques barely worked for siRNA, let alone mRNA, and these were much larger molecules, and there was a complete unknown. So there was neither a way to deliver it to the right cells, nor any reason to believe you could do it in a way that didn't create a flu-like response and shut down protein expression. So the question is, what do? You can wait for that over time to improve, or you could say, okay, are there things that could motivate trying this modality? And what interested us was, so you need to have some destination in mind. We were thinking, could you imagine kind of injecting a molecule in a body and make arbitrarily any protein you want, right? So that isn't what our first goal was, but that was the ultimate promise. So say another way, 14 years later, if mRNA could have been delivered to humans in an innate, without stimulating innate immune response, and to cells that could express proteins, would we have the biomanufacturing infrastructure that we've built as an industry with billion-dollar plants, many of them? So imagine taking unsuspecting Chinese hamster ovary cells, manipulating them to make a protein, then over 17 steps making the pure protein, ever so little of it. I mean, just if you think about it, I always tell people, if an alien landed on Earth and said, how are you making these proteins? They'd go, holy cow, what is all this, right? Given that every cell in our body, other than enucleated cells, can do this trick, can make any protein. So the idea is, how do you get a code in? I'm describing it just to be colorful. So the journey was, like, what can work and how hard is it to do this? So when you get involved in trying to enable a platform, what you don't want to do is do it for one reason. Because if you want to do it to make factor VIII, then every step along the way you foreclose a lot of questions because you're just trying to make a drug. So that's one of the tricks, is to have in mind categories of multiple drugs that, if only you could do this, could benefit from it. That's how we started. And so vaccines were one of 7 areas that we thought could benefit, but we really had no idea vaccines would ultimately be the most kind of what I'll call low-hanging fruit in a completely barren place, right? So most people look for low-hanging fruit in accessible places, but if you go to a far-out place, you also want to care about low-hanging fruit. So I would say the way you make this balance is you want to have the financial muscle, the patience, the scientific curiosity to first let the platform manifest. I'd say if you look at Alnylam, it took them 10 years to figure out actually what to do with siRNA. Along the way, every time they had to raise money, they had to tell investors what it is that they were going to do with it. But deep down, and again, Phil Sharp is here, others are here, John Maranganori can tell us, deep down, I bet you what they were going to do with it was changing the more they learned what they can do with it, right? Because ultimately, it's kind of human hubris to say, here's what I'm going to use this platform for, when the platform doesn't exist. So the problem is, our investment world, and I'll stop, actually doesn't at all agree with that point of view. So you cannot get money to develop a platform from which can come pandemic vaccines and the like, because an investor wants you to tell them exactly what your lead program is and your follow-on program is, and yet they want that clairvoyance in a platform that doesn't yet exist, or is in its infancy, or it's in an academic lab. So that's a real tricky thing. The answer we found in the Moderna case, and I would urge any entrepreneur in the room to go back to the roots of biotechnology, is partnerships. If I list to you every large company, I see George in the back of the room, Regeneron, Millennium, Genentech, Amgen, Biogen over and over again, every one of these companies actually spent quite a bit of time forging partnerships with pharmaceutical companies until they actually had products that defined who they are. That phase seems to get forgotten. In the last 10 years of zero interest rates, every biotech entrepreneur, encouraged by investors, said, I don't need partnerships. Are you nuts? I'm going to give my great drug away. I'm going to keep the drug for myself. And this industry is basically, in my view, being brought to its knees when it comes to biotech innovation because of that one choice. Pharma industry was, in the case of Moderna, the only reason we could actually have our platform, and needed to. In other words, we had AstraZeneca, Merck, Alexion, and then later Vertex, give us hundreds of millions of dollars to develop a platform from which the whole planet benefited in the form they did not envision, but ultimately they're the ones who shared in that platform development risk. Merck got a cancer vaccine out of it. The current melanoma vaccine is entirely the product of that. AstraZeneca worked on some programs. So, long way of saying, I'd say the way to break the back of this platform product kind of dissonance is partnerships that allow you to develop the platform before you start asserting what the best first program is.
That's really interesting point of view. Chris, I wanted to ask you, very often when the inventors of these work on these platforms, they aren't thinking downstream about the practicality of manufacturing. What's going to be the cost of goods? What will be the cost of a dose of the drug? To say nothing of the practical implications of making and something never before on the planet, and getting it through regulatory hurdles where it's not understood in the same way that a small molecule is made. And so we know that, a number of executives are saying, well, maybe thanks, but no thanks. This new platform's a huge headache. So what are your thoughts about the challenges of manufacturing of these? And when do you start to think about manufacturing of a new platform before you've gotten the sense that Noubar just described of which therapeutic areas it can travel to?
Yeah, one of the things that people forget is, okay, you want to go, you've got an idea about what's causing the disease, you want to have a molecule that's going to go address that, but that molecule doesn't exist anywhere, right? And even the ingredients are not just sort of things that you can pick off a shelf or you phone up your local friendly neighborhood chemical supplier and you're just going to mix them up. You often have to synthesize these. Then you're going to go and try it. But at some point, you got to move from the flasks and the test tubes to scale. And that actually can take quite a bit of time. Sometimes you need specialized equipment. We acquired a company last year called Reata, first treatment for Friedreich's ataxia. This thing starts with olive tree leaves. And we need tons and tons of olive tree leaves. When we had wildfires in Spain last year, I was worried about our olive trees. But it then goes through 7 different phases of synthesis and refinement in 13 different countries by the time it all gets to where it needs to go. And the supply chain from end to end, by the time you start with a harvest of some olive tree leaves till the time you get a capsule at the end is 3 years. And so these things take an awful lot of time. Now, smaller companies don't have really the resources to do that. And so after we acquired, well, how do we make that more efficient? Can we have double sourcing? Can we make this less expensive? Yeah, another example is our antibody for Alzheimer's disease. And we know how to make antibodies, but every one of them is different. But we had to build a factory that cost $2 billion just to make this one antibody, right? And so at what point do you do that? It's a really good question because you don't really want to spend $2 billion until you know you have something that's working. And this is sometimes where actually scale can help in a company, and I think this is where Noubar's point is so important around partnership. George is in the back, and we actually were able to work with Regeneron as we were developing medicines when I was at Sanofi, and part of that was around some of the things like CMC and scaling up, and now Regeneron actually could be a partner to others because they've built that skill set themselves. But that is a tricky part that, because once you have a drug, now I want to go into clinical trials. Now I need this at bigger scale, and taking this up progressively into larger and larger quantities takes an awful lot of money. And it really, I think if you're a smaller company, you really want to partner on the CMC issue as fast as you can. We looked at another company, we didn't acquire it, but I can tell you that one of the problems was the selling price was identical to the cost of goods. So it was a really cool medicine, but somebody was going to have to redesign this molecule because zero gross margin doesn't really work.
Right.
So, forgetting the microphone. Chris, you also spoke about, advancements in the neurospace, and I just want to quickly get to our last topic, it looks like, if I look at the watch, on shifts in therapeutic areas. And if you look at prescription based revenues and the forecasts over the next decade or up until 2030, we still see oncology being very much in demand. We still see double-digit 10% growth. But we've also seen over the last years, in particular in the metabolic disease space, huge growth and huge advancements, but also in the neurology space. Probably 10% of the industry pipeline right now is in neurology. But we've also heard earlier this morning from Philip Sharp that he thinks that this space is scientifically by far the hardest to crack. And I'd like to turn to you, John, and hear a little bit about Where are we as an industry? You've personally contributed a lot in that space, and I'd like to hear a little bit your perspective on how have we done as an industry? Are we doing enough as an industry, particularly in that space?
We're not doing enough, and in many cases, we're not incentivized to do enough. And Phil's right, it is the hardest area. When I look in rare diseases, there are more than 10,000 known rare diseases that together affect about 10% of the world's population. Very few, about 5% of those diseases have any treatment whatsoever. And the majority of those rare diseases are neurologic based. In some disease, a disease like Bain disease that many of you may have never heard of. There's 13 subtypes of Bain disease. CLN3 is the largest of those subtypes. Affects in the United States here about 5,000 young children. It's effectively like childhood Alzheimer's. You know, they're born healthy, and then they lose the ability to walk, to talk, to eat, to think, and generally die in their teens. Devastating disease. The biology is so hard. But we've also made it harder because when we do have some of these breakthrough ideas, many of them coming out of our great research universities, the complexity of tech transfer agreements. And then you get to the complexity of clinical trials that we've touched on. The challenges with regulators, development of endpoints, threats to the accelerated approval process. We're never going to develop medicines for these brain diseases and many neuromuscular diseases, neurology-based, unless we're willing to accept a reasonable degree of risk in developing biomarkers and surrogate endpoints and more using the accelerated approval pathway. Realizing that we'll make mistakes, but if we don't, we know exactly what the outcome is going to be. And just one last area I'll highlight here is intellectual property and how important that is and how under assault it is today. IP and the whole notion of intellectual property is grounded in the United States Constitution. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8 lays out the importance of protecting inventions and ideas to promote a flourishing economy. In bioscience and life science, it really came of age with the Bayh-Dole Act that said that, for any, and obviously the NIH and other government grants provide enormous amounts of research and development dollars to our great universities. Bayh-Dole, of course, said that there are going to be no government strings attached. You can license that for the benefit of the inventor, for the university, and developed in our companies. And ultimately, the universities play such an important part in the virtuous circle of R&D, but it's companies that develop our medicines. 70% of all new medicines originated in biotech companies, small emerging companies, oftentimes then needing to be partnered to advance them for patients, and many times either acquired by or developed further or commercialized by our large companies. And that's under assault today. People who want to use these march-in rights, that's never what they were intended for. The IRA, in some ways, was a backdoor around the protection of intellectual property. If we undermine IP, we are going to undermine the research and development establishment in the entire country.
Absolutely. I think there's nobody in the room who will disagree to that statement.
No, it's speaking to the choir a little bit in this room, but this is the message we need to take forward, that people sometimes view IP as blocking innovation or blocking access or unnecessarily driving up prices, and it's not. We need to change the mindset that intellectual property is a good thing, and there was a reason the founders put it in the Constitution, that it needs to be nourished and protected. It needs to be an enabler of technology.
Yeah. Chris, maybe I want to take an attempt with you to bring all the topics a little bit together that we've discussed. So in the current environment with the possible constraints that we discussed coming from IRA, with the hard science that we have, in particular in the neurology space, with the opportunity to leverage possibly intelligent technologies to advance actually across the value chain in these harder spaces. What do you think is required for a company like yours to sort of break through the next wave of innovation?
Well, yeah, I've been in this business for 35 years and seen a lot of the arrival of some of the technologies that Mike talked about. And there have never been a lack of challenges in this industry. And in some ways, I think that's one of the things that drives us in this industry. First is there's a never-ending unmet medical need. As many new technologies as we have discovered, we still have significant unmet need. And with all of these complexities and challenges, quite honestly, a lot of us love solving problems and finding solutions. And I don't think most of us would be very happy in a business where nothing really changed and you only had modest levels of innovation. And I think that's why our industry has been able to adapt along the way. And costs have gone up. There is a lot of pressure on pricing. If you look between just now and the end of the decade, there's going to be a significant increase in the number of people over the age of 65. That is the population that is the biggest users of healthcare. Healthcare systems are going to have even more pressure on funding those. I mean, you've already seen concerns around funding of Medicare. Single-payer systems in Europe, where the health systems are funded by tax revenues, are going to be under a lot of pressure because those economies are growing at 1 or 2%, but the need is going to grow at significantly in excess of that. So I think as an industry, I think what I have seen over the years that still always works is you have to go to an ever higher level of innovation. You're not going to get along with Me Too innovation, and that is a lot of what we do. We are an industry of lemmings. Suddenly GLP-1s, I mean, guess how many GLP-1s suddenly have popped into people's pipelines, right? And obesity, how many PD-1s came along, right? But the system doesn't want that. If you do have something that's innovative and you really are addressing unmet need, generally the system will pay for that. I do think we're going to have to figure out how to make this more of a cost-effective model. I think that's going to take innovation in the process of how we bring drugs to market. And I think some of these tools like AI can help us. I do think we also have to advocate. I think as George Yancopoulos said, I mean, why are we being picked on when we create so much value? Well, that is partly because people have this unmet need. The healthcare systems are under pressure, and more of the cost is being put on patients. And I think we have to advocate for the value that our industry brings. John and I are both fighting with our organizations to think about the payer system, PBM reforms. Out of every dollar that gets spent on medicines, we as an industry get 48 cents. And we're the ones who are taking all the risk and putting all the billions into research and development. And it's the distribution chain that is taking 52 cents. That's got to change. So I think it's not enough just to be looking for the next bit of innovation. We have to explain to people why it is so important that companies like the ones we represent here get the funding they need and get the returns that we need, because otherwise we are never going to be able to go after some of those 10,000 rare diseases and other unmet need that John talked about.
Thank you very much for bringing it all together. We have 1.5 minutes for maybe 1 or 2 questions. It depends how quickly they are being answered. Anybody with the most urgent question in the room? Wow.
They're surprised.
Go for it.
So I love this panel, and I don't think I need it.
You got a microphone.
Okay. Marian Risk, Managing Director at AWS Life Sciences. So I'm going to ask a question about intelligent technologies. With the challenges I've heard about getting a drug to market and finding the patients and identifying the right sites to generate patients, there are technologies that the FDA is willing to use and accept, and it's been done in rare disease and chronic illnesses around simulation using in silico. So simulating how a patient's going to feel, detecting risk, dose escalation, all these are actually improving precision. They're improving the risk mitigation, and they're actually giving us evidence and insights on go, no-go decision-making. So I'd love to ask the panelists about the appetite to use these technologies that are available, that are readily being used. And this year there was a book published about towards good modeling and simulation to educate the regulatory science, to uplift, and making sure regulatory agencies as well as academic organizations understand. So my question is, now that these technologies are advancing and they're being accepted, I just love to see, some input on how this may be accepted within life sciences today.
Well, the one thing I'll just say is I think there is a huge appetite, but remember, we not only have an FDA, and I think the FDA can be open to these things, but then you also have people who reimburse. And you'd be surprised how married the entire world is to the double-blinded placebo-controlled study. And taking any kind of way to streamline that with technology, even if the FDA approves it, can often get some skepticism downstream with reimbursement. And I'll give you just one example of how that can happen. The FDA actually has approved a digital medicine, essentially, for the treatment of ADHD. And it's just it's a video game that you can download and get an electronic prescription for. That company is just about bankrupt because no payer will pay for it. Now, you would think with ADHD, why give children and even adults things that have potential side effects? This has clearly no side effects, but it's not quite what they're used to seeing. And Paratherapeutics is another one, had actually a digital medicine for the treatment of substance abuse. That company's gone bankrupt because the payers wouldn't pay for it. So there's a whole need to educate the ecosystem. It's not just to get to the FDA, you've got to also get it accepted by physicians and payers. But, we'll get there, but it unfortunately doesn't go very fast.
Yeah, I might just comment on this because I think the dynamic in knowledge about a medicine or how you work it up has changed a lot over the last 20 years. It used to be that the FDA, when most of the drugs were small molecules, that no one knew more about the small molecules than the FDA. And you might come forward with a small molecule, and they would have seen several others in the same category. So they knew a lot more than you. Now it seems to me that more and more it's kind of a knowledge partnership, because you're coming with something that's not been on the planet before. Probably you actually know more about it than they do. They're seeing it for the first time. And so the kinds of things you're talking about, bringing kind of auxiliary things to help development, I don't have an answer, but I would imagine there's going to be more openness to that as the partnership together figures out how to get this therapeutic modality from the laboratory to the patient.
Just to add that we have to keep in mind the concept of time, a sense of urgency. FDA, others are willing and open to listen to this and do demonstration models, but we need to, like we did with Warp Speed and COVID, we need to realize we needed the gold standard of safety and efficacy for the vaccines that we all needed. We needed them for everybody, universal access, and we needed them as absolutely soon as possible. So let's think about things in a very different way.
Thank you. I think we could go on for a little longer, but I'm getting polite but strong signals from the right side of the room. Thank you very much.
Nice job, Mike.